Imagine standing on the edge of a cold, endless grassland, the wind whispering stories you can almost understand. Far in the distance, you spot a line of riders, their armor glinting in the sun, moving as one with their horses. These are not just any warriors. They are the Sarmatians, a people shaped by the wild freedom of the Eurasian steppes, born to ride and destined to change the world. They came from lands so far away that to the people of Rome, it felt almost like the end of the world. Their armor was unlike anything seen in the West. Small, overlapping metal plates, almost like the scales of a dragon, shimmered across their bodies. Each Sarmatian carried a lance so long that it seemed impossible to wield, yet in their hands it became an extension of themselves. With this, they could break even the strongest lines of enemy soldiers in a single, thunderous charge. But who were these riders who seemed almost larger than life? Were they just another group of enemies at Rome's borders or something more? The truth is, the Sarmatians were a mystery wrapped in legends. Their stories passed down in whispers and old songs. Some called them the Horsemen of the Apocalypse, believing their arrival meant great change or even disaster for those in their path. Yet, as we look closer, we see that Sarmatians were not simply destroyers. They were survivors, innovators, and sometimes, surprisingly, partners. In time, Rome did not just fear them. The empire learned from them. Rome even invited Sarmatian warriors to fight in its own armies, recognizing their skill and bravery. Today, we are going to follow the trail of the Sarmatian Guards, the elite cavalry whose tactics, armor, and stories left a mark that reached all the way to the heart of Rome. We will discover how their way of life, forged in the saddle, shaped not only their own destiny, but also influenced the world around them, from the distant Black Sea all the way to the misty hills of Britain. Did you know that the Sarmatians were among the very first to use lamellar armor? Those clever rows of metal plates tied together? This design was lighter and more flexible than the Roman mail, and would go on to inspire the armor of Byzantine and even medieval knights. Or that their long two-handed lances were so effective, the Romans themselves copied the idea and changed their own cavalry forever. So as we begin this story, imagine what it must have been like to see these riders in action. Picture the ground trembling with the beat of thousands of hooves, the sun flashing off scales of metal, and the sound of voices raised in battle cries that echoed across the ages. If you are as fascinated by ancient worlds as we are, let's explore this legend together. And if you enjoy discovering the hidden stories of history, we invite you to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires, so we can keep uncovering the secrets of the past, one story at a time. Picture this. While Roman children were learning to read scrolls in marble courtyards, thousands of miles away on the endless grasslands of the Eurasian steppes, Sarmatian children were already gripping the reins of their first horses. This wasn't just a different way of life. It was a completely different relationship with the world itself. The Sarmatians didn't simply ride horses. They lived with them in a partnership that went deeper than anything we might imagine today. A Sarmatian warrior could sleep in the saddle during long migrations, eat dried meat and mare's milk while galloping across the plains, and shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while his horse thundered beneath him at full speed. Their horses weren't just transportation. They were companions, weapons, and the very foundation of their entire civilization. But here's what makes their story truly fascinating. The Sarmatians created a society where the line between human and horse almost disappeared. They developed techniques that allowed them to become one fluid entity with their mounts. A Sarmatian could guide his horse with subtle shifts in weight while keeping both hands free for weapons. This wasn't just skill. It was an art form that took decades to master. Their children began this training before they could properly walk. Picture a 3-year-old Sarmatian child, barely tall enough to reach a pony's belly, already learning to read the subtle movements of the animal's ears, the meaning behind different snorts and whinnies. By the time they reached adolescence, these young riders could perform maneuvers that would leave even experienced Roman cavalry officers speechless. The steppe itself shaped every aspect of their culture. Unlike the Romans with their stone cities and permanent borders, the Sarmatians lived in a world without walls. The horizon was their boundary, the grass their road, and the stars their map. This nomadic existence created warriors who could think and move like the wind itself, unpredictable, swift, and impossible to pin down. Now, here's where their story takes a remarkable turn toward innovation. While most of the world was still using simple chainmail or basic leather protection, the Sarmatians developed something extraordinary: lamellar armor. Imagine hundreds of small, carefully crafted plates, each one shaped like a fish scale and made from iron, bone, or even hardened leather. These plates were then laced together with incredible precision, creating armor that moved like a second skin. This wasn't just clever craftsmanship. It was revolutionary engineering. Each individual plate could absorb and distribute the impact of a blow, while the flexible connections between them allowed the warrior to move with complete freedom. When a Sarmatian rider bent forward in the saddle or twisted to shoot an arrow behind him, his armor moved with him like liquid metal. The genius of lamellar armor went even deeper than its flexibility. It was actually lighter than the solid mail shirts that Roman soldiers wore, yet it provided better protection against the specific weapons of steppe warfare. A sharp arrow that might punch through chainmail would often be deflected by the overlapping scales of lamellar armor, and if one plate was damaged in battle, a warrior could replace just that single piece without needing to repair an entire garment. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this armor was how it reflected the Sarmatian understanding of warfare itself. Romans thought of battle as a collision between organized formations, shield walls crashing against shield walls. The Sarmatians saw battle as a dance of individual skill and mobility. Their armor had to allow for the incredible acrobatics of mounted archery, the sudden turns and charges of cavalry warfare, and the fluid movement between offense and defense that characterized steppe combat. The influence of this innovation would ripple through history in ways the Sarmatians could never have imagined. Centuries later, when Byzantine craftsmen were creating armor for their own elite cavalry, they would look back to these steppe innovations. Medieval European knights, those legendary figures we think of as the ultimate armored warriors, were actually wearing evolved versions of Sarmatian designs. The famous plate armor of the Renaissance had its roots in those carefully crafted scales that first appeared on the windswept grasslands of ancient Eurasia. Even more intriguing is how this armor reflected the Sarmatian worldview. They saw themselves not as conquerors who imposed their will through brute force, but as artists of war who achieved victory through superior skill and innovation. Their armor had to be beautiful as well as functional. Many surviving pieces are decorated with intricate patterns and inlays that transformed each warrior into a work of art. This combination of practical brilliance and aesthetic beauty tells us something profound about Sarmatian culture. These were people who refused to accept the limitations that others took for granted. When existing armor designs couldn't meet their needs, they didn't complain or make do. They invented something better. When the demands of steppe warfare required unprecedented mobility and protection, they found a way to achieve both. The legacy of their innovation extends far beyond military history. The Sarmatian approach to problem-solving, combining traditional knowledge with bold experimentation, would influence craftsmen and inventors for generations. Their ability to create something entirely new while respecting the wisdom of the past offers lessons that resonate even today. This was a culture that truly lived in the saddle, where every aspect of life was shaped by the rhythm of hoofbeats and the endless horizon of the steppes. They created not just warriors, but a way of being in the world that would leave its mark on history long after their own civilization had vanished into legend. Now imagine you're standing on a hill overlooking a vast battlefield, and suddenly you hear it, a sound like thunder rolling across the earth, but it's not coming from the sky. It's the drumming of thousands of hooves, and riding toward you are warriors unlike anything the world had ever seen. These are the Sarmatian heavy cavalry, and in their hands they carry weapons that would redefine the very nature of mounted warfare. The Contus Lance wasn't just a spear, it was a revelation in engineering and combat psychology. Picture a wooden shaft so long that it stretched nearly 20 feet from tip to butt, longer than two tall men standing on each other's shoulders. This wasn't a weapon you could wield casually with one hand while controlling your horse with the other. The Contus demanded everything from its wielder, both hands gripping the shaft, perfect balance in the saddle, and a level of horsemanship that bordered on the supernatural. But here's what made the Contus truly extraordinary. It transformed the entire geometry of battle. Traditional cavalry charges relied on getting close enough to strike with swords or shorter spears, which meant warriors had to survive that terrifying final moment when opposing forces crashed together. The Sarmatians changed that equation completely. With their massive lances, they could strike their enemies while still far enough away to maintain the devastating momentum of their charge. The physics of a Contus charge were absolutely devastating. When a 1,200-pound horse moving at full gallop combined its energy with a skilled rider wielding a 20-foot lance, the impact could indeed penetrate multiple opponents in a single thrust. But this wasn't just about brute force, it required incredible precision and timing. The Sarmatian warrior had to judge distance perfectly, account for his horse's movement, and strike at exactly the right angle to maximize the lance's penetrating power. What's truly fascinating is how this weapon reflected the Sarmatian understanding of mounted warfare as a science. They realized that the key to cavalry success wasn't just speed or courage. It was about maximizing the transfer of kinetic energy from horse and rider to the target. The Contus was their solution to this physics problem, and it was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its effectiveness. Training with the Contus was an art form that took years to master. Young Sarmatian warriors would spend countless hours practicing with wooden training lances, learning to couch the weapon properly against their body while maintaining perfect balance. They had to develop the strength to control such a massive weapon while moving at high speed, and the coordination to strike accurately while their mount thundered across uneven ground. The psychological impact of facing a Contus charge was perhaps as important as the physical damage it could inflict. Imagine being an enemy soldier and seeing a line of armored horsemen approaching, their lances creating what looked like a moving forest of deadly points. The sheer visual intimidation of hundreds of 20-foot lances all aimed directly at you must have been absolutely paralyzing. But the story of the Contus doesn't end with Sarmatian victories on distant battlefields. It takes a remarkable turn when we consider how profoundly it impressed their greatest enemies, the Romans. Here was an empire that prided itself on military innovation and tactical superiority. Yet when they encountered Sarmatian heavy cavalry, they didn't try to defeat the tactic, they adopted it. The Romans were practical people above all else. When they saw something that worked better than their existing methods, they had no pride about learning from their enemies. Roman military writers began studying Sarmatian techniques, trying to understand not just how the Contus worked, but how to train their own cavalry to use it effectively. This led to one of the most fascinating chapters in military history, the recruitment of actual Sarmatian warriors into Roman service. Rather than simply copying the weapon, the Romans decided to hire the masters themselves. They offered generous terms to Sarmatian tribes, inviting entire units of heavy cavalry to serve under Roman banners while maintaining their traditional weapons and fighting methods. The numbers involved were staggering. Historical records tell us that over 5,000 Sarmatian cavalry were stationed in Britain alone, with thousands more serving along the Rhine frontier and in other provinces. These weren't just mercenaries hired for a single campaign, they were full-time professional soldiers who brought their families, their horses, their entire way of life to the far corners of the Roman Empire. Now here's where the story becomes almost mythical in its implications. When these Sarmatian cavalry units arrived in Britain around the 2nd century after Christ, they brought with them not just their military skills, but their entire cultural identity. They carried dragon-shaped banners that roared in the wind, wore their distinctive scale armor, and maintained their traditions of honor and loyalty that were quite different from typical Roman military culture. Some historians have proposed a tantalizing connection. Could these Sarmatian warriors, with their emphasis on individual heroism, their distinctive armor, their code of honor, and their elite status, have contributed to the legends that would eventually become the tales of King Arthur and his knights? The timing and location seem remarkably coincidental. Here we have heavily armored cavalry stationed in Britain, serving a concept of imperial authority, maintaining their own cultural identity, and operating according to codes of conduct that emphasized personal honor and loyalty to their leader. The parallels are striking when you think about it. The legendary Knights of the Round Table were described as heavily armored horsemen who served their king with absolute loyalty, followed codes of honor that set them apart from ordinary soldiers, and were considered an elite force capable of extraordinary deeds. The Sarmatian ally, or cavalry wings, that served in Roman Britain possessed remarkably similar characteristics. Even more intriguing is the question of how these warriors would have appeared to the local British population. Here were exotic horsemen from distant lands, wearing armor that gleamed like dragon scales, carrying impossibly long lances, and displaying a level of martial skill that must have seemed almost supernatural to people accustomed to more basic forms of warfare. The cultural exchange that must have occurred is fascinating to contemplate. These Sarmatian families lived in Britain for generations, intermarrying with local populations, sharing their stories and traditions, and gradually becoming part of the complex cultural mix that characterized post-Roman Britain. Their tales of steppe warfare, their legends of heroic horsemen, and their distinctive military traditions would have become part of the local folklore. This is how history works its magic, taking practical military innovations from the grasslands of Eurasia and transforming them, over centuries of storytelling and cultural evolution, into the timeless legends of Camelot. The Contus Lance that once decided the fate of battles on the steppes may have inspired tales of Excalibur and the fellowship of knights who gathered around a circular table to pledge their service to an ideal of justice and honor. The legacy of these dragon riders extends far beyond their military effectiveness. They represent one of history's great examples of cultural adaptation and influence, showing us how innovations travel across vast distances and long periods of time, constantly being transformed but never losing their essential power to inspire and amaze. Are you fascinated by this ancient legacy? Then comment your thoughts, like the video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more epic journeys. There's something deeply human about the relationship that developed between Rome and the Sarmatians, a story that begins with fear and transforms into something approaching mutual respect. It's the kind of tale that reminds us how the greatest enemies can sometimes become the most valued allies, and how wisdom often lies in recognizing strength rather than simply trying to crush it. Picture the scene in the Roman Senate during the 1st century after Christ. Reports were flooding in from the frontier commanders along the Danube River, and the news was troubling. These weren't the usual complaints about barbarian raids or tribal skirmishes. Roman officers were describing something entirely new, a form of warfare that their legions weren't prepared to handle. The reports spoke of horsemen who moved like a single organism across the battlefield, their armor gleaming like the scales of some mythical beast. They struck with the force of a thunderbolt and vanished like smoke before the legions could organize a proper response. Roman infantry, the backbone of imperial military power for centuries, found themselves helpless against these swift, armored riders who could appear anywhere on the battlefield and disappear just as quickly. What made these reports even more unsettling was that they came from experienced commanders, men who had fought Germanic tribes, Celtic warriors, and every other type of opponent the empire had encountered. Yet here they were, admitting that they had never faced anything quite like the Sarmatian heavy cavalry. The traditional Roman response to barbarian threats, disciplined infantry formations supported by auxiliary troops, simply wasn't working against these steppe warriors. But Rome had always been an empire that learned from its challenges, and the Sarmatian problem forced Roman military thinkers to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about warfare. For centuries, Roman doctrine had been built around the idea that disciplined infantry could overcome any opponent. The legions had proved this theory from Gaul to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Yet here were opponents who seemed to exist outside that framework entirely. The turning point came when Roman commanders began to study their enemies more carefully. Instead of simply trying to find ways to defeat the Sarmatians, they started asking a different question. What made these warriors so effective? The answer was both humbling and illuminating. The Sarmatians weren't just lucky or primitive fighters who had stumbled onto successful tactics. They were highly sophisticated military professionals who had developed a completely different approach to warfare. This realization led to one of the most pragmatic decisions in Roman military history. Rather than continuing to fight against Sarmatian effectiveness, Rome decided to harness it. The empire began actively recruiting Sarmatian warriors, not as desperate mercenaries or conquered subjects, but as elite specialists who could teach Romans new ways to fight. The process of integration was fascinating to witness. Roman military culture had always been about uniformity. Every soldier equipped the same way, trained to the same standards, fighting according to the same manual. Suddenly, they were incorporating warriors who operated according to completely different principles. Sarmatian cavalry didn't fight in neat formations with standardized equipment. Each warrior was an individual artist of war, with gear adapted to his personal fighting style and decades of training in techniques that couldn't be learned from any Roman manual. The Romans created an entirely new military category for these warriors: cataphracts. The word comes from an ancient Greek term meaning completely enclosed, which perfectly described the appearance of a fully armored Sarmatian heavy cavalryman. But the Romans understood that they weren't just adopting a new type of soldier, they were incorporating an entirely different philosophy of warfare. These cataphracts became something extraordinary within the Roman military system. They were elite shock troops who could be deployed at critical moments to break enemy formations or exploit battlefield opportunities that traditional legions couldn't handle. A charge of Sarmatian cataphracts could shatter an enemy line that had successfully resisted Roman infantry attacks, turning stalemate into victory. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this military evolution was how it changed Roman thinking about warfare itself. The legions had always been about collective strength. Individual soldiers subsuming their personal identity into the larger machine of the legion. The cataphracts operated on almost opposite principles. Each warrior was expected to be a complete fighting unit, capable of independent action and personal initiative. This created a fascinating dynamic within Roman armies. You had traditional legions operating according to centuries-old principles of discipline and uniformity, supported by cataphract units that embodied individual excellence and tactical flexibility. It was like combining a symphony orchestra with jazz musicians, two completely different approaches to the same art form. Now here's where the story takes an almost magical turn. The Sarmatians didn't just bring their fighting techniques to Rome, they brought their entire cultural aesthetic, including one of the most psychologically powerful innovations in military history, the dragon banners. Imagine seeing one of these banners for the first time. It wasn't just a piece of cloth fluttering in the breeze. The Sarmatian dragon's standard was a hollow metal sculpture, crafted to look like a fearsome serpent or dragon, with an open mouth and a fabric tube extending behind it like a tail. When mounted on a lance and carried by a charging horseman, the wind would rush through the hollow body and create an otherworldly howling sound. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Picture yourself as an enemy warrior, already nervous about facing Roman legions, when suddenly you hear this unearthly wailing rising above the thunder of approaching hooves. The sound seemed to come from the banners themselves, as if the metal dragons were actually alive and screaming their fury as they rushed toward you. But the genius of the dragon banners went beyond their intimidation factor. They served as practical military tools, helping cavalry units maintain formation and communicate across the chaos of battle. The fabric tails would stream out behind the charging horsemen, creating visible markers that allowed commanders to track the movement of their units even through dust and smoke. The Romans were so impressed with the effectiveness of these dragon banners that they didn't just allow their Sarmatian allies to continue using them, they began manufacturing their own versions for Roman cavalry units. This wasn't just military pragmatism. It was cultural recognition that the Sarmatians had created something genuinely superior to existing Roman standards. What's truly remarkable is how long-lasting this influence proved to be. The dragon banners that first appeared on Sarmatian lances in the steppes of ancient Eurasia would continue to be used by Roman and later Byzantine cavalry for centuries. Long after the original Sarmatian tribes had vanished into history, their dragons were still howling across battlefields throughout the Mediterranean world. The adoption of dragon banners represents something deeper than just military innovation. It shows us how Rome, at its best, was capable of recognizing excellence regardless of its source. Here was the greatest empire in the ancient world, proud of its traditions and confident in its superiority, yet humble enough to learn from warriors it had initially feared and fought against. This transformation from enemy to elite reflects one of Rome's greatest strengths, its ability to absorb and integrate the best elements of the cultures it encountered. The Sarmatians weren't conquered and forced to abandon their identity. Instead, they were invited to become part of something larger while maintaining the very characteristics that made them valuable in the first place. The legacy of this relationship extends far beyond ancient military history. It demonstrates how genuine strength often lies not in rigid adherence to tradition, but in the wisdom to recognize when something new might be better than something old. The Romans didn't diminish their own greatness by learning from the Sarmatians. They enhanced it. And those dragon banners, howling their ancient songs as they charged across battlefields from Britain to Mesopotamia, became symbols of this transformation. They represented the moment when Rome stopped seeing the Sarmatians as barbarian enemies and began recognizing them as masters of their craft, worthy of respect and capable of teaching even the mighty legions something new about the art of war. There's something profoundly melancholy about the way great peoples fade from history, not through dramatic battles or catastrophic defeats, but slowly, gently, like morning mist dissolving into the warming air. This is how the Sarmatians disappeared, not with a bang, but with the quiet whisper of assimilation, their distinct identity gradually blending into the larger currents of history until only echoes remained. Picture the final generations of pure Sarmatian culture, perhaps in the 4th or 5th centuries after Christ. The Great Migrations were reshaping the entire face of Europe. Germanic tribes were moving westward. The Hunnic confederations were rolling across the steppes, and the Roman Empire was transforming into something entirely different from what it had been. In this swirling chaos of peoples and cultures, the Sarmatians found themselves caught between worlds that were all changing at once. Some joined the service of Rome, as we've seen, becoming the empire's elite cataphracts. Others merged with Gothic kingdoms, contributing their military expertise to new confederations of warrior peoples. Still others moved eastward, perhaps joining the emerging Byzantine Empire or becoming part of the complex tribal alliances that characterized the early medieval period. But with each generation, with each intermarriage and cultural exchange, the distinctive Sarmatian identity became a little more diluted. Yet here's the beautiful paradox of their story. As the Sarmatians themselves vanished, their innovations and ideals became more influential than ever. It's as if they dissolved into the bloodstream of European civilization, spreading their genetic material throughout the entire body of medieval culture. Consider what happened to their military innovations. The lamellar armor that Sarmatian craftsmen had perfected on the steppes became the foundation for Byzantine military equipment. When you look at paintings of Byzantine cataphracts from the 6th or 7th centuries, you're seeing the direct descendants of Sarmatian armor design. Those carefully crafted scales, laced together with such precision, evolved into the sophisticated plate armor systems that would eventually protect the knights of the Crusades. The Contus Lance underwent a similar evolution. Medieval European knights didn't suddenly decide to use longer lances because it seemed like a good idea. They inherited this innovation through a chain of military development that stretched back to the Sarmatian heavy cavalry. The famous couched lance technique that became the signature of medieval knighthood was essentially a refined version of Sarmatian shock tactics, but the influence went deeper than just equipment and techniques. The entire concept of heavy cavalry as an elite military force, the idea that a small number of highly trained, heavily armored horsemen could dominate a battlefield, came directly from the Sarmatian military tradition. When we think of medieval knights as the ultimate warriors of their age, we're really seeing the culmination of innovations that began in the grasslands of ancient Eurasia. Even more fascinating is how Sarmatian cultural ideals found new expression in medieval chivalry. The steppe warrior's emphasis on individual honor, personal courage, and loyalty to one's comrades became central elements of the knightly code. The idea that a warrior should be more than just a fighter, that he should embody certain moral and ethical standards, has clear connections to Sarmatian traditions of warrior conduct. Think about it. The medieval Romance literature that gave us stories of Arthur and his knights, of Roland and the paladins, of countless brave heroes riding forth to defend the innocent and uphold justice, all of this traces back, in part, to cultural memories of those dragon-bannered horsemen from the distant steppes. The very archetype of the noble warrior, fighting not just for conquest but for principles, carries the DNA of Sarmatian ideals. The dragon banners themselves lived on in ways that would have amazed their original creators. The hollow metal standards that once howled across battlefields from the Black Sea to Hadrian's Wall became the ancestors of the heraldic banners that decorated medieval European warfare. The concept of using distinctive standards to inspire troops and intimidate enemies, the idea that a banner could carry almost supernatural power, all of this can be traced back to those original Sarmatian innovations. But perhaps the most remarkable survival of Sarmatian influence is something we can still see today in the countryside of Eastern Europe. In remote areas of Ukraine, Poland, and Hungary, traditional horsemanship techniques survive that show clear connections to ancient steppe practices. The way certain riders sit their horses, the methods they use to train and communicate with their mounts, even some of the equipment designs, all carry echoes of skills that were first perfected by Sarmatian horsemen over 1,000 years ago. This brings us to one of the most intriguing questions in historical study. How do we measure the impact of a people who left no written literature, built no great monuments, and established no lasting empire? The Sarmatians created no pyramids or colosseums, wrote no epic poems that survive to our time, founded no cities that still bear their name. Yet their influence on the development of European civilization was profound and lasting. Perhaps this tells us something important about how history really works. We often think of historical influence in terms of the obvious and dramatic, the conquests of Alexander, the engineering of Rome, the art of Renaissance Italy. But sometimes the most important influences are the subtle ones, the innovations and ideas that spread quietly from culture to culture, generation to generation, until they become so embedded in our way of life that we forget where they originally came from. The Sarmatians gave Europe its image of the ideal warrior. They provided the technical innovations that made medieval heavy cavalry possible. They contributed to the cultural ideals that shaped the concept of chivalry. They influenced military tactics, armor design, horse breeding, and even the aesthetic traditions that gave us heraldic art. All of this from a people who are remembered today mainly by specialists in ancient history. Their story offers us a different way of thinking about legacy and immortality. We tend to assume that to be remembered, we need to build something permanent, create something that will outlast our physical existence. The Sarmatians suggest another possibility, that our most lasting influence might come not from what we preserve unchanged, but from what we contribute to the ongoing flow of human development. They became part of the story of European civilization, not by remaining separate and distinct, but by sharing their innovations and ideals so generously that these gifts became woven into the fabric of the cultures they encountered. In losing their separate identity, they gained a different kind of immortality, one that lives on in every medieval romance, every image of knightly valor, every moment when we imagine the thunder of heavy cavalry charging across an ancient battlefield. The wind still carries their voices, if you know how to listen. Every time we hear a story of brave knights riding to defend the innocent, every time we see a flag snapping proudly in the breeze, every time we watch a skilled rider and horse moving together as if they were a single creature, we're witnessing the continuation of traditions that began with warriors who rode out of the morning mist of history, carrying their dragon banners and their dreams of honor. They vanished into history, yes, but they also became history. Part of the great human story of innovation, courage, and the endless quest to become something better than what we were before. In the end, perhaps that's the greatest victory any people can achieve, to disappear not into oblivion, but into the very soul of civilization itself. What lessons can we draw from these forgotten horsemen? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires for more untold stories of the ancient world.